Hey everybody, welcome to Side by H. Today we're going to do the install video on the Fox IQS system on the Maverick X3 here. If you're unfamiliar with what Fox IQS is, we recently did a brief overview and explanation video, so you can check that out. It's a pretty quick video, a few minutes long, and it will give you an idea of what's going on here. Unfortunately, I have to do this out in the cold on the front porch because I've neglected to build a garage for the past 2 years, but that's something I intend to do in the next few months, get started. So if you want to subscribe and watch the process and go through it, maybe give me some suggestions in the comments. If some of you guys know YouTube channels like Side by Side Blog or that Oster Cruiser guy or that Braden Price, what those guys got going on is basically not comparable, and it's going to be nothing compared to what I'm doing. The Side by H garage is going to be absolutely huge, so you don't want to miss out on this. But other than that, let's go ahead and get started on this project here. Okay, so our first step is going to be to cut some of this plastic bodywork out of the car. And the reason for that is this was the left front shock originally off the car from the factory. And the way they come mounted is with the shock reservoir facing down like this underneath the shock tower brace. But because we have these extended IQS compression adjusters here now, we're gonna have to flip them because at full suspension compression, going with the factory configuration, these towers could lean towards each other and make contact and get damaged. So what we have to do is take this left front shock, and it's going to be now the right front shock, but with the reservoir facing outwards instead. You can see that will give more clearance from the pivot point here to where the IQS tower is. So if we do it that way, our problem is going to be at full compression, the shock coming up, and the shock reservoir contacting the body right here. So that's the reason we're going to have to notch this out a little bit and make some clearance here. And you can also do this just for fun. Some people flip the shocks just to look cool. So if you want to flip your shocks, you just have to notch your body out here and have right at it. To remove this plastic, we're going to use this corner here as a reference point, and then we're going to remove 4 inches of plastic right here and 3 inches of plastic right here. I'll measure that up. I'll use some masking tape to give myself a line to follow with the Dremel tool and a cutoff wheel. First, I'll try a couple of the throwaway areas that we're going to cut off just to see what speed to use on the Dremel tool and get a little bit of a feel for it. We did do some test cuts with the Dremel here, but we didn't find it very effective. There was a few problems. One was it melted the plastic quite a bit. Number 2, it was hard to keep on a nice straight line. Number 3, it was tough to get in the angles we needed to with the body work in the car like that. And also, the blades broke very easily, the cutoff wheels. Maybe they were pretty cheap wheels, but they kept breaking pretty quickly. We switched over to oscillating tool here with this fine tooth blade on it, and it worked very good. The plastic didn't melt. It was very easy to keep a nice straight line across the plastic. So I would highly recommend going with an oscillating tool over a Dremel tool, even though the instructions recommend the Dremel tool. It doesn't work too good. You will get some plastic slag left over after using the oscillating tool, but a lot of it can be just picked off by hand. And what you can't get that way, you can just take a nice sharp razor blade and it peels off quite easily. So that'll give you a pretty nice finish, and I'd say that's about the best technique to cut the plastic out to get the shocks in. So there's the final product. We got our plastics all cut out nicely there, so definitely go with an oscillating tool. It makes the job very easy, much easier than I thought it was going to be, and looks a lot better than I thought it was going to look too. So definitely use the oscillating tool. So now that we have our plastics cut out, we're ready to install all 4 shocks on the car next. Okay, so we got our shocks all installed, tightened down, and torqued to about 90 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to put the wheels back in the car, drop it back on the ground so we can move it around a little bit. And after that, we'll remove the seat and the seat belts from the passenger side so that we can get the side panels off the tunnel to get the wiring harness to run from the front to the rear of the car. Okay, so the wheels are back in the car is on the ground. We have the passenger seat removed. And now we can remove the plastic panels along the side of the tunnel to run the wiring harness from the front to the back. So here's our wiring harness here, which is pretty simple once you get it all laid out. Everything's clearly marked. Here's our leads to our rear shocks right here. See, it's marked. Ignition, power, and ground, all clearly marked to hook up. Our ECU plug-in. Switch for the dash. And then the leads to the front shocks. So I've got the lead to the front shocks detached from the main wiring harness here just to make it easier, but we're just going to take this, put a little bit of dielectric grease on there, not too much. Plug this up into the Fox IQS adjuster. Pass this wire underneath the shock bolt at the top. Just one thing to note with these wires, there is a paint mark right here, and you're going to want that paint mark to be just above this clamp here, to ensure you have the proper amount of slack between this clamp and this plug. And then this is going to mount up in behind this radiator support bolt right here on the back. And then down underneath here, we'll feed this in through the little rubber grommet kind of thing where the wiring for the headlights and the winch goes through, and feed it into the interior of the car along the tunnel. Okay, so we got all those wires clamped in there. I'm not going to tie them up with zip ties yet for slack. I'm just going to wait and see at the end to where it makes most sense to do that. But this is all installed. We got these wires clamped on with the paint mark just above the clamp behind the radiator support here to ensure there's the right amount of slack in the system right here. To get the ECU mounted in the car, in the back of the manual, they do give us a template here, so we'll cut that out. Stick it on the top corner of this plastic panel here and use the template to drill some holes to mount the ECU. Okay, so we got our holes all drilled and our ECU is mounted up to the plastic panel in the proper orientation. I do notice some subtle changes in design and assembly on this 2020 machine that are different from the Fox manual that was written, I think, back in 2017. One of the first steps they have you do is pull this plug off here, off this metal clip, and tie it down to the factory wiring harness to give clearance to the ECU, which will sit right here. But I have another hole over here that looks like I can just move this whole thing over, clip it back in just like that. So we just need to move this plug over to clear for the ECU right here. So here's the position of the IQS switch where it's going to be installed. So I'll pop out this panel, feed the wires through, and install the Fox IQS switch just like that. On the switch harness here, you'll see a couple more paint marks. The reason that they are there is they just don't want you to use zip ties around the PCB board here, so zip ties only on the outsides of the paint mark. Okay, so we are ready to hook up all our power terminals here to power the system. You can see I have my negative battery cable disconnected just so we can avoid any oopsies over here on the bare metal terminals. So we'll just pop this off here. Once again, everything's clearly marked. You have your ignition accessories, which will be on the bottom here. Your power from the battery will be in the middle, and your ground will be up on top. Something else to note, if you are running a winch, you'll have your relay, etc. here in your wiring, so it does tighten the space up, so you have to maybe get a little bit creative just to work around this lost space that you have right here. So for my rear shock leads, I had to change things up a little bit. The Fox manual only gives direction on cars with external reservoirs, which sit up high here on the frame. So they are expecting the plug-in to be way up here and want you to run the wire down behind this plastic cover and follow this frame rail down until it meets the factory wiring harness. So because my shock leads start down so much lower here, I just improvised. I left as much slack as I could without having the wire rub on the intercooler cover right here. And then I tied into the cross member right here that goes from side to side in the frame, and then started heading down towards the factory wiring harness. The exact same on the left side here. I just left as much slack as I could in the wire without having it rub on the air intake box, ran it down to the cross member, and then down to the factory wiring harness. So here's what it looks like underneath here. You can see I drilled a couple holes in the firewall there just to get a zip tie through to secure the harness on the way down. And then I meet up with the factory wiring harness and just zip tie into it and follow it along into the rear of the tunnel on both sides. So here's where the rear shock leads come into the tunnel. You can see I do have some access cable looped up right here. But one thing to know is this wiring harness also works for 4-seater models. So you're going to end up with over 3 feet of extra cable to deal with on a 2-seater. So I've ran mine all the way up to the front of the tunnel here and done a loop and come all the way back, and it plugs in right in this spot here. Here's our ECU mounted to the plastic panel. You do have to leave some slack on the wires here, obviously, to get the panel off. And when you replace the panel, you kind of have to tuck these up out of the way as you go and pop the panel on. Like I said, the winch relay is not ideal to be there for this installation, but it is what it is. And I think it should be okay. Everything looks like it'll be fine, but I will check it in a year or so and just make sure nothing's rubbing through. As far as wire routing, I don't think any two cars will be exactly the same. Best thing to do is just work through it one step at a time, make sure everything's secure and not getting pinched, and you'll get there eventually. Okay, so everything's all hooked up. We're going to test the system here, but before I put the panel back on and the seat back in and stuff like that, I'll make sure everything works and we have no problems. So what should happen here is we will power up the system, and the system is supposed to calibrate for about 5 seconds, which is indicated by a 5-second light on the switch here. And it apparently does that on every startup. So here's the moment of truth. We'll power up the system. Red. I can actually hear all the servos initializing right now, and everything looks good. It does flash fault codes if there's problems, so it looks like everything's fine in the system right now. Medium, hard. Seems to be working. Like I said, I can hear the servos. Not sure if you can hear that on camera, but everything seems to be functioning. So it is quite easy to demonstrate the effect the system has on the car. It's in soft mode right now. I'll just manually jounce the suspension by hand here. So there's soft, go to hard. Back to soft. So as you can see, there's a pretty clear, obvious difference between firm and soft modes. Okay, so that concludes our installation video of the Fox IQS system on the Maverick X3 here. All we have left to do is just pop the passenger seat back in and set our ride heights properly, which ride heights I'll save for a separate video. And then we're good to take this thing out for a rip. If you're interested to see the Fox IQS system in action, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I'm going to do some testing and some short and long-term reviews, so I hope some people found this video helpful. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you on the next video very soon.